So, last week I began my sermon with, there is an essential theological word that summarizes the passage we've come to today in the New Testament book of Hebrews. And then I said, but I'm not going to tell you what that word is just yet. I want to let you try to figure it out as we read the passage. But here's a clue. That word is in the passage, the word that is this major theological topic and category, this essential theological term. Well, that opening works again today. Because there's another major, essential, even bigger, much bigger theological term that is what our passage in this whole chapter is all about that we're beginning today in Hebrews chapter 11. Now, does anybody remember what last week's word was from the end of chapter 10? Persevere, perseverance. Very good. Now, last week I was impressed with a few of you that shouted that out and recognized that. This week I'll be impressed if there's anybody who doesn't recognize it because it's so obvious in our passage today. I'll be negatively impressed if you don't get it this week. So, I'm looking for one term that is a major theological term, and it'll be in our passage that we're starting today, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. We're starting on the whole chapter today, but today we're actually not even going to get all the way to verse 6 today. But Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 6, page 851. Page 851. I'm going to find it too, because I want to show you something there in a minute. Come on, the pastor should be able to find these passages really fast. Come on, Joe, come on. Everyone's looking at you. All right, here we go. All right. Hebrews, where did I do my printout? Where did I put my printout? All right, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, he still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, and he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Okay, so what's the word? Okay, is there anybody who didn't get that and wants to raise your hand? Don't do it. Don't raise your hand. I'll lose all no, I'm just kidding. So this chapter will go on that way. I just want you to notice this is a famous faith chapter, Hebrews chapter 11. So it'll keep going like that. We'll read next after, what comes next is by faith, Abraham. And then Abraham is dealt with for a little while. And then by faith, Isaac. And then by faith, Jacob. And by faith, Joseph. And by faith, Moses. And then we read a little bit of extra stuff about Moses. And then by faith, the prostitute Rahab, and that was regarding the walls of Jericho, and that was under Joshua. And then what more could I say? I do not have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. So there's a lot of characters from the Old Testament that we're going to be considering in this chapter, that this chapter considers. Faith is the topic. In our language, the word can be used rather generally. We might say, for example, there are 5 major faith traditions: the Hindu faith, the Buddhist faith, the Muslim faith, the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, and then a bunch of little smaller ones in between. But the faith that the Bible most often, almost always much more narrowly focuses on, predates all of those 5 major faith traditions. This passage particularly makes clear that this is an individual faith that the Bible is more concerned with. And this passage makes clear that it's a relationship with God that this faith establishes, and this faith spans the entire Old Testament, from the beginning of the Old Testament all the way to the end of the New Testament. The same faith. Notice that that's built into what's going on here, because this is a New Testament book we're reading that's teaching New Testament faith to the receivers of this letter to the Hebrews. And yet it is going all the way back to the beginning of the Old Testament to demonstrate this faith. What does that tell us? It tells us it's the same faith. This is important, because I don't know about you, but I was confused for a really long time. And I know people, Christians, I hope they're Christians, because being a Christian isn't always about being right? It's about being in relationship. That's what this whole chapter is about. But I have a friend who's a hyper-dispensationalist. Wait a minute, disclaimer. He's not really a friend. He's an acquaintance, okay? He's very confused. He thinks that in this age, that people got saved this way, and then this age, the people got saved this way, and then the Jews, they got saved by the sacrifices. Well, this book of Hebrews has been telling us up until and including part of chapter 10 that no, that's not how the Hebrews got saved, because all those sacrifices, they didn't actually accomplish anything except point to Christ and the salvation that his sacrifice brought once for all time. And the book of Hebrews and the book of Romans teaches that same thing. And so there's much more in common of our faith all the way through the Bible than there is differences. In fact, let me say that the only difference is how faith has become more informed along the way. As God revealed more and more of himself, faith then got a little bit more fuller of details, but the faith was the same. Otherwise, this chapter would be illegitimate. He's taking us all the way back to the faith that we'll see, and we just read, that Abel had. Abel, as far as we know, the second son of Adam and Eve. By faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as a righteous man. And it can be the same faith because it's the same God, and it's been the same plan all along, and it's the same one who saves all along, Christ, in his substituting for us with his life for us on the cross, his death and resurrection. That has always been the plan from 1 Peter chapter 1. Christ, he was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times. Our faith is informed a little bit more now. And so we say, oh, we trust in Christ now. But trust in God, it was the same trust. It was the same faith, just a less informed faith back then. Faith in God has always been the means of access to the plan of God and the work of God. So this is amazing to think about. I've thought about this a long time ago and was quite impressed. Can you think of a more accessible manner for God to make himself available than faith? Little children can do it. People on their deathbed can do it. The thief on the cross did it. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. It can happen like that. It doesn't have to be tremendously informed. God, save me. It doesn't have to be very informed at all, in fact. That'll be obvious as we go through this chapter. It gets more informed along the way. Just like, and that's, sometimes humanity is dealt with in very much a parallel to the way a single individual is dealt with. And so just like when you or I got saved, we might not have known anything at all about how God did it. We just cried out to God and said, God, you're God and I'm a sinner and save me. And that is how, and then as we grew as a disciple, started reading our Bibles, started hearing good teachings, we grew in our understanding. So our faith became more informed, and that is the way the entire human race has been. As the entire human race got more and more understanding, their faith got filled in with more and more details, more and more informed along the way, but it was the same faith, and both ends of the spectrum, whether Abel, who understood very little, perhaps, maybe he understood more than we realize, understood very little, to all the way to the end times, and those who have seen about as much as you can see and understood about as much as you could understand. It's the same faith that we're going to see here saves. Because God doesn't change. And his plan of salvation has always been on Christ. And even though Christ was at a certain point in time, his salvation reached all the way to the beginning of time and all the way to the end of time in its effectiveness. And so we now, 2,000 years after Christ, look back. Our faith looks backwards to what he did. The faith of the Old Testament looked forward to what God was going to do, even when it didn't understand what God was going to do. It believed that God was going to do whatever it took to save. That faith did. And that's why it's the same faith. God will take care of it. God will get it done. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. Now, the first verse. It's a working definition that was very basic and then will need to be filled in throughout the rest of the chapter. Verse 1, now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Now that's a pretty general definition so far. It's going to get further defined. But at this point, this could almost be a definition of how the power of positive thinking can revolutionize your life, right? Being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. And so let me just, if I'm going to be trying to work this in the realm of the power of positive thinking, I want to become a millionaire. I will become, no, you can't say millionaire now, right? You got to say billionaire. Millionaire is hardly impressive these days. All right, so a billionaire. I want to be a billionaire. And so I'm going to work this faith. I'm going to keep telling myself. I'm going to keep confessing that with positive thinking to a point where I get sure of what I hope for, and that is that my hope is that I'm going to be a billionaire, and someday I will be a billionaire, and if I train myself enough, then my faith will also turn into certainty. Certain, the definition says, certain of what we do not see, and so I just work it, and work it. And some people have taken the Christian message and kind of turned it into that kind of thing, right? We call it the prosperity gospel. And say that's what faith, that's how you can now take the saving faith and use it to bring all of God's blessings into your life. Unfortunately, almost none of the people in the chapter we're about to read figured that out. I'm sort of kidding. In other words, many of them went through some great suffering, as we'll see as we go through chapter 11. So if that's a secret use of faith, then all these heroes of the faith never figured it out. I'm being somewhat facetious here. That is not a secret. That's an illegitimate use. Now, God brings blessings. God brings blessings, and it often accompanies our following Him, our pursuing Him. But those are ancillary. Those are, what do you call that? Those are like fringe benefits that if we're seeking, we might get in trouble. But if we're seeking God, they might come along, and we're thankful for them. This faith being defined here is not about any of that. But if you just stopped at verse 1, you could think it is. This faith is going to be focused completely on an individual's relationship with God. And we start to get some of that context with verse 2. This is what the ancients were commended for. The ancients were commended for. The word ancients here, more literally, is the elders. It's the religious leaders of the past, the forefathers. Old Testament elders. But keep in mind, this is a New Testament book written to New Testament believers, and that is us. And so these elders are our elders too. They're not just Old Testament elders, they're our elders as well. And fortunately, that's the way most good Bible-believing teachers and preachers treat them. Father Abraham is our father too. Father of faith, Abraham is, right? The book of Romans teaches us that. And Moses is our father too, and a forefather, I should say, or our ancient too. Let's see, where am I here? Okay, so moving on to verse 3, provides more context. And this applies to us now, not just our forefathers. Us and our forefathers together. The tense is the present, but it's still also referring to them and us all together. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Let me say that again. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. I think the writer is basically getting here to faith teaches us that God is omnipotent. God is all-powerful. God is the one who made everything there is. God can do that. He's quite capable of doing that. God's creation, this creation that we're focusing on here, is not like the way we create. We take some raw material and cut it and chop it and heat it and blend it and pound on it and pour it and make something new, some new device, some new material out of some old material. That's not the way God creates and the way we're talking about now. God probably does that kind of thing too sometimes, but he creates out of nothing. We can't do that. We'll never be able to do that. He creates out of nothing. And you know what's really kind of nice? Is science more recently, pretty much in my lifetime, has realized that. And that's what the Big Bang Theory is. Everything, the entire universe, suddenly was created out of nothing. That is pretty close to what the Bible tells us right here, not only back in Genesis, but what we just read. God makes everything not out of what was visible. He made it out of nothing. I think we should say, bravo, science. You're starting to come along. You're starting to get it. I mean, the Christians and the Jews knew it since they've had the book of Genesis, but, you know, thousands of years ago, but you're coming along. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. I think the real point is proper faith begins with the realization that God is all-powerful, so powerful, the universe was formed at his command, and so there is nothing that our God can't do. I think that's the point of verse 3. Faith realizes that intuitively, at least, even if it can't spell that out, even if it's not informed enough technically to be able to spell that out. God is simply that powerful, that capable. And faith needs to be grounded in that understanding of God, that trust in God, that he is all of that and more. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. If that's not your faith in God, then how can you possibly believe that he's going to save you for all eternity and place you safely in a new heaven and a new earth if he's not powerful enough to have been the one who made this one? It doesn't work. That math doesn't work. That math doesn't add up. Our faith can't be grounded in a weak and limited God. It has to be grounded in the reality of who God is. He's the opposite of weak and limited. He can do anything. Real faith, and then finally, and this will get more fleshed out as we go through the chapter, real faith trusts God. Real faith trusts God, the character of God I'm talking about now, his goodness, his faithfulness, his truthfulness. He is to be more trusted than a closest friend or brother or father or mother or our own self. He is more trustworthy than our own self. From Proverbs chapter 14, there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. We need to trust him more than we trust our own heart, our own desires. Or from Proverbs chapter 3, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. Now, with the rest of the chapter, the writer of Hebrews teases out more and more a proper understanding of faith with a bunch of real-life examples from the ages, from the ancients, starting all the way back to Adam and Eve's second son, as far as we know. We know Cain was the first son, Adam, it sounds like Abel may have been the second son, the second one we know of anyway. The second son, Abel, that their first son, Cain, murdered. Verse 4, by faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. He did that by faith. By faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offering. And by faith, he still speaks even though he is dead. I think the point here, among others, is right faith produces right response. Right faith produces right response. Abel's right faith inspired him to produce a right offering. Now, it's a nice teaching moment that we have here in the scriptures in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, and I'm going to read some of it in a minute, that it was a formal offering between Cain, his not acceptable, and Abel's that was. But we don't do formal offerings in New Testament times. Why is that? Because our entire life is our offering. And so when we're looking at Cain versus Abel's offering in a formal setting, the application is our offering of our complete selves. And so it applies 24/7, a right offering versus a wrong offering. Abel's offering compared to Cain's offering. Okay? So we're talking about our response to God, our faith response to God, and that'll get fleshed out a little bit more in a minute when I read from the New Testament and what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. I guess I'm going to do that at the end. So, okay. So it's really, really interesting that he takes us all the way back to the first family. And here's why I say that. Because everyone in that first family so far that Genesis rolls out, and we'll read the passage in just a second, Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel had a direct relationship with God. Of course, Adam and Eve did because they were in the garden with God. But we're going to see in a minute when I read it that Cain and God had at least two direct conversations, and the second one is a back and forth. Cain said something, God said something back to him, and vice versa. So faith is not simply about knowing there is a God and knowing some things about God. The faith that we're going to talk about here. Oh, it's not just knowing there is a God. That's the beginning of it, but that's not the completion of it. Because Cain had all that. Cain had all that. And Adam and Eve had all that. But when they listened to Satan, the serpent, instead of God, that was a faithless act. That was a faithless offering of themselves. Faithless, not faithful. I'm not saying Adam and Eve weren't forgiven and saved and all that. I'm not saying that. I hope they were. I think they probably were. I don't have that hope for Cain, however, compared to Abel, contrasted to Abel. All right, so from Genesis 4, just a little bit to get us back to the original story. Genesis 4, verses 1 through 7. Adam lay with his wife. This is post-garden. They've been kicked out of the garden. Adam lay with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a son." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, but Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Here's the first conversation that I mentioned. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." Direct relationship there with Cain and God. Regardless, Cain chooses to kill his brother Abel instead of doing the right thing. After hearing from God directly to do the right thing. So clearly faith is not simply about believing God. It's about something else. But Cain is not commended for faith, only Abel is. And he's commended for faith this way. By Abel, in verse 4 of our passage now, by faith Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith he was commended as a righteous man. By faith he was commended as a righteous man. In other words, his faith made him righteous. And that's the same word Paul uses in the book of Romans to talk about gaining the righteousness of Christ by faith. And here it is again, much abbreviated. By faith he was commended as a righteous man. Cain and Abel both believed in God, but only Abel had a saving faith. A righteous faith. Righteousness means salvation because it's the righteousness that we get ultimately from Christ. Verse 4 and let's see a little bit more. By faith Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings, and by faith he still speaks even though he is dead. He was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. There have been all kinds of suggestions about the difference between Abel's offering and Cain's offering. I've heard sermons that said, oh, it was because Abel's offering was from, what Leviticus commanded. It was from the fat of an animal. And Cain's offering was grain. And that's not what Leviticus talks about. But actually, Leviticus talks about both kinds of offerings. And so we're back to sort of a stalemate there on that argument. And so, let's see. My commentator says, Scripture never says there was anything inherently superior in Abel's offering. In other words, it doesn't have to do with the offering itself, apparently. It has to do with the heart of faith, or the lack of a heart of faith behind the offering. Abel had a faith that somehow made his offering pleasing to God, it seems, and Cain did not. Abel's faith made Abel's offering somehow pleasing to God. Cain's lack of faith somehow made Cain's offering not pleasing to God. But if he did the right thing, God told him, he would be accepted. Back to what I'm getting here is that only the right faith can produce the right offering. Wrong faith will produce a wrong offering, even if the offerings are technically fine. The offering made without right faith is not acceptable, I'm suggesting. At this point, I'm reminded, I said we were going to get to this at the end, and we're at the end here, of Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount that we just looked at recently in the Thursday night Bible study. He says, and he's talking about false prophets, I guess you could say, or bad faith. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. I believe we are learning that, as I just said, that right faith produces right action, right offering, right fruit, good fruit. Was Abel perfect? Was Abel sinless? Absolutely not. No one has been. No one ever has been except Jesus Christ himself. But somehow the faith of Abel allowed him to bear good fruit, bring a right offering, and because this whole passage is about faith, okay? I'm not making a tremendous leap here when I say this. The faith of the two are being compared, and the point is Abel brought a good offering and Cain did not, and the whole point of the passage is to teach us about faith. And so this is not a big leap. But faith allowed Abel to bear good fruit and bring a right offering, and Cain was clearly missing that faith. We're going to stop there. I expected to get to verse 6, but that's enough for now. We're going to celebrate communion now. But this contrast of Cain and Abel in their offerings to God can be instructive to our celebration of communion today, because this particular ceremony of celebrating communion is kind of the closest thing we come to the experience of a formal offering, right? We're offering ourselves here at this table. And so, considering Cain versus Abel and coming to this table with right faith versus wrong faith, I think can be helpful in preparing to come to this table with right faith, like Abel. So and that dovetails in with how Paul tells us to prepare for communion. If I could find that piece of paper. There it is. No, that's not it. Paul warns us, therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. A man ought to examine himself before he eats of the bread and drinks of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without recognizing the body of the Lord eats and drinks judgment on himself.